Hello and welcome to part 2 of my conversation with horror writer Adam Nevill. In this extract, Adam takes me through his writing career, his experiences with the publishing industry, the volatility of horror as a genre, and his experiences exploring the landscape of Devon, England, which inspired his book The Reddening. You can check out part 1 of our conversation on this channel if you haven't already. Do remember to hit that like and subscribe button to help keep this channel growing. And now, part 2 of my conversation with Adam Nevill.
But I actually like this image better.
Yeah, my eyes have turned black.
Yeah, it
I
looks cool.
look more like a horror writer.
Yeah, it looks cool.
Maybe this is a good thing.
Yeah. I had some questions about your older works. Which of your novels was the most difficult, or the more difficult to write? And how long does it take you generally to write?
Yeah, there's I guess I'm not that consistent because it took me a long time to kind of get airborne writing horror. So my first novel, I started in 1997. I finished it around 2001. It took me about 4 years to write, to complete. And then I had a long wait until PS Publishing, who are now, they're like a mid-sized genre publisher now, but they were a smaller press at the time. There was just no horror being published back in the early 90s, the second half of the 90s, other than the established authors, James Herbert, Clive Barker, Stephen King, so on and so forth. So there was more of a scene in America with brands like or imprints like Leisure Horror. But I waited a long time for that book to come out. And then it took me really another 6 years to finish the next two, Apartment 16 and The Ritual, that were actually called, my original titles were Down Here with the Rest of Us and Children of the Beast.
Down Here with the Rest of Us was for Apartment 16?
It was.
Okay. I prefer Apartment 16, I think. Maybe because that's what I'm familiar with.
The publisher did, and all the bookshops did as well.
Okay.
That was a kind of working title I always worked under. So that took me 10 years to finish the first 3 books, but I didn't have a publisher really for any of them. So when Pan Macmillan then published me, they and my agent pretty much said, you need to write a book a year. And I was like, what? A book a year? This time, though, I was more or less a full-time writer. So then, writing Last Days in 1 year, that was really tough because I had a baby in the house. The house we were living in had terrible subsidence, and it was a freezing winter. The first one when there'd been snow in London, and I could see in the room I was working in, I could see a crack like that and snow on the ground outside. So it was cold. We had a baby who we were keeping her warm, and I went for a really ambitious story. I wanted to write a found footage horror novel about a 70s cult, but with a kind of history that went back centuries.
Yeah. Several different countries.
And I had about 11 months to do it. And I was also doing some. I could live off I guess at that time, off my earnings as a writer. But I didn't trust books or publishing because I'd worked in the industry, and I just thought, well, I got 2 books, I got another 2-book deal. There may never be another one, and I was offered some really good freelance work to start an imprint for HarperCollins. So the same year I had to write the book and be a parent with no experience of children, write an ambitious book, I also started a fiction list for a major publisher. So the pressure, it was like deep sea pressure. And halfway through Last Days, I thought I'd made a terrible mistake and I should never have started the book. That was quite a bleak moment, but I rallied and I finished it. And for such a long, ambitious book, I still look back now and think, it was 11 months. How on earth did I deliver that in 11 months?
And he won the August Derleth Award. Wow. So
it's become one of my most popular books, but it taught me, okay, if I'm writing more or less full-time, I can write a book in a year. And so then House of Small Shadows, no one gets out alive. Huge research project, and that was written in a year. Lost Girl, again, lots of research, and Under a Watchful Eye. So those books then, I wrote one a year. And writing books, stories that were that ambitious in 1 year was difficult. Whereas The Reddening, I carried on, I followed that precedent. It was going to be an indie book, so I was putting a deadline on myself, and I finished it in a year, and I read it, and I wasn't happy with it. So I spent another year rewriting it and editing it. So that felt really comfortable for The Reddening. That was a 2-year book, and there isn't a whole lot in The Reddening I would change.
that's my favorite of your novelas.
And bless you for having it as a favorite.
Well, it was also
because that was a big step for me, because I'm coming out of traditional publishing with professional editors and so forth, and I'm going indie, I'm going it alone. And I do use a freelance editor who I worked with for years, but it's all on me now. This is the first novel beyond a traditional publisher, Pan Macmillan and St. Martin's. It really was do or die. And it's become one of the most popular novels I've written. It's only been out since 2019, and even though it's been published through our small press, which clearly is not a big international publishing company with offices in London and New York, but the sales have matched Last Days. Last Days came out in 2012. And The Reddening has already caught it up.
But I would imagine, do you see a big boost in sales because of the awards, the award consideration, because it won the August Derleth Award? Is that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that's a really, I like the award. It's a lovely kind of peer gesture, but it's very much enclosed within I guess, a peer group of horror writers around an organization. But I don't know how far that signal travels. It's lovely to have, I was very, very touched that the book was given that award. But interestingly as well, this was a novel that was not going to be in high street bookshops. This was a novel that would live or die really online. Funnily enough, it has appeared in bookshops. I've seen it in bookshops, but I have no influence on that. One of the things I don't allow with the Ritual Limited books are big discounts. It's something I really disagree with in traditional publishing, whereas they would, the prevailing rate of a discount is you sell your books to retailers at 54%, but actually the discounts are closer to 60 to 80%. So the publisher's net receipts are much smaller, and this is why writers have had about an 80% pay cut in the last 13 years because of book discounting. So I don't allow the big discounts on Ritual Limited books. And I've been told by numerous experts, you will never get a book into a library or a bookshop if you insist on a 40% discount. And I've stuck to it, and the books appear in libraries and bookshops. So they do make exceptions, not obviously in, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of copies, but The Reddening really was the first book I would be reliant upon the internet, and it didn't really faze me because, you know, I look at British bookshops, you would struggle to find a horror title other than Stephen King in most of them. And I know that, you know, the horror readership is enormous compared to crime and thriller. Yeah, it's niche, but when viewed internationally, it's enormous. And most horror readers know they're not going to find what they want to find in bookshops. So horror has kind of created its own marketplace online with particular websites and retailers that it uses. And I thought, well, I'm only interested in offering my books to readers of horror, whereas traditional publishers have to broaden that market to a wider adult market of readers. And that's where traditional publishing really struggles.
What do you think?
It doesn't want to publish niche. So it'll publish horror when horror's hot right now, when horror's the new black. But if horror goes off the boil, it doesn't want to publish it. But the large horror readership, I think it just grows and grows. So the challenge for me was to move from bookshops and traditional publishing to the online, I guess, horror market as a formerly traditionally published author. And what I spent years doing was trying to connect and engage with my readers through my newsletter and my social media. So I can talk to readers directly. And what I've actually done since I started Ritual Image in 2016 is grow my readership quite significantly by purely focusing on horror readers. And because let's be honest, they're the only people who are going to enjoy my book.
Right.
So I would never chase, you know, thriller readers or what have you. I'm just interested in publishing books for horror readers and online.
What do you think happened in the late 90s, early 2000s for horror to be huge?
I don't think there's any one single thing. There's always variables. I mean, there was, because it was the biggest popular fiction genre in the 80s. I mean, the British writer James Herbert, I think, was the best-selling British author throughout the 80s and 90s until J.K. Rowling came along. And he's a horror writer, James Herbert. And before him, in the 70s, it was the Danish writer Sven Hassel who wrote military thrillers about an SS penal regiment. And before him, it was Dennis Wheatley, who also wrote horror. He wrote The Devil Rides Out, which became the brilliant Hammer horror film. But I think there was a lot of over-publishing. There was just too much. And the quality really varied through the 80s and the 90s. I know because I was reading so much of it. Yeah. You had the most incredible writers at that time. Clive Barker, you know, Ramsey Campbell. You had Thomas Ligotti. You had some terrific writers. Stephen King, obviously, Peter Straub. So I think there was over-publishing. The one thing I think really was a real game changer, I think it was Thomas Harris's Silence of the Lambs, because Thomas Harris was kind of writing horror novels, but with a human agency. He moved it away from the supernormal and the supernatural, although there's an element of that to Hannibal Lecter. He does have these sort of extra senses. But that film was so big and that novel was so big. Do you remember then? It's almost every other book published was about a serial killer.
Okay.
And an FBI agent chasing them, or a police officer in various police forces around the world. And then that gave rise to the huge kind of boom in crime. So it's the kind of serial killer thriller, I think, that ate horror's lunch.
Okay.
And weirdly, what started to bring it back, I was working in publishing and I was publishing in this area. I think it was paranormal romance. Charlene Harris and Laurel K. Hamilton. It was the romance authors that were writing vampire romance. And publishers started to think, hang on, a reader's interested. Because there were books about shapeshifters as well and weird creatures, and it was pretty bizarre paranormal romance. I used to publish it at Virgin. And in the UK, I don't know, US has always managed to maintain a kind of a horror in bookshops, but the UK is very fickle. And Sphere published a book really well by an American author called Christopher Ransom called The Birthing House, and it was massive. It was like the #1 novel. And then horror, this is what happened in publishing. Publishers were then like, horror? People want to read horror. Because I remember being told, I tried to start a list at Virgin Books as a fiction editor, and Random House had bought us. And they told me there is only room in British publishing for one horror writer, and that's Stephen King. So that was their attitude. You know, there was James Herbert and other writers, but generally they were saying, you know, it's a niche interest, and readers don't have any interest in anyone but the big writers that established themselves in the 70s. But anyway, this Christopher Ransom book was big. And publishers then started thinking, well, horror, if horror's working, we've got to have horror. And I'd spent years writing my second and third book, Apartment 16 and The Ritual. So then started asking agents, have you got any horror? Have you got any horror? And that's when finally the door opened for me. Because my agent said, well, yeah, I've got this guy, Adam Nevill, who's been writing it for years. He's had one small press novel published, but he's got these 2 books. And I think there were 4 London publishers wanted them. So they ended up going into an auction. I couldn't believe it. After like 15 years writing for small presses and in total obscurity, except for this one lovely publication that PS Publishing did, which I think had 700 copies, a 700 print run.
That was horror as well, or was that?
That was horror. That was my first novel, Banquet for the Damned, which is an occult horror novel set in Scotland. It was my first novel.
Okay. I thought that was PS Publishing. No, it was...
PS Publishing published it to start with.
Okay.
Then we did it at Virgin. Then Pan Macmillan published it. So it's had 3 UK publishers. So yeah, then that was then the story of Apartment 16, The Ritual, that came out in 2010 and 11. So from around 2008, I think, to 12, horror was really exciting again, and lots of it was published. You know, there was Let the Right One In. Dan Simmons made that tremendous comeback with The Terror. The kind of zombie apocalypse became a genre all of its own after Max Brooks's World War Z. There were so many series started about the dead rising, basically George R. Romero's idea of the dead coming back.
That book was huge. What year was that? That was 2012, 2011?
It started kind of in around 2008, I think. David Moody was probably the first person I can remember doing it. And then there are all kinds of Scott Sigler, Jonathan Mabry, lots of writers were having these long-running series. And then around kind of 13, 14, it was dipping again. And I think the grip lit thriller took over, and it's never stopped. From sort of Gone Girl, you know, the twisty thrillers with an unreliable, usually female narrator. Those seem to have dominated popular fiction since. So, you know, looking at the checkered history of publishers' interest in horror, which is all I'm going to write, that's what I write. And I had this great run of 8 books in traditional publishing. And I thought, you know, in order to continue to write horror, the horror that I want to write, a kind of literary horror, and to complete a body of work, I just don't trust publishing anymore. I'm going to do it myself and see if it works. And touch wood, so far so good. We're 7 books in, and my pre-existing readership seems to have come across with me, and I'm managing to expand it now because I'm not tied to high street bookshops. or just UK publishers. We published the books really worldwide, all the editions on the same day, which is when I was working in publishing, I thought that's how to make horror work. Because my traditionally published books, they'll come out in the UK, and then the publishers will try and sell foreign rights into different territories. And it's great if America picks up the book. But if they don't, and you're confined to the UK, and publishing strategies keep changing, now it's all about grip-lit thrillers. And publishers tend to follow each other. They follow the fleet like shoals of fish. They're all publishing the same thing at the same time. And then they all move on to the next thing. Well, to just get out of that racket, I felt I had to do it myself.
You get some pushback from publishers about some of the manuscripts you submitted, or
I expected more than I got.
Okay,
but no, my first editor at Pam Macmillan, Julie Crisp, she was brilliant. She brought me in. She championed me there. We disagreed on the second half of The Ritual. She didn't like it. She suggested, interestingly, I remember Julie suggested an alternative, which was very similar to the second half of the film, which came years later.
I didn't make it to the second half of the film.
So that was director David Bruckner and Joe Bartner wrote the screenplay. They came up with a different ending, but it was very similar to what my editor had suggested years before. No connection between the two. But I stuck with the ending, and she always said, "Look, I don't make requests. I make suggestions." And we had a really good working relationship for a few books. The one I expected to be sent back to me on fire or as a box filled with ashes was House of Small Shadows, because it was such a change in direction and gear and speed and tone. I think after The Ritual and Last Days and Apartment 16. Well, it was closer to Apartment 16.
Yeah.
But it's a weird idiosyncratic book that I just felt so compelled to write. And for some readers, it's their favorite book. And for an equal amount of readers, it's their least favorite book.
Well, for some of the viewers of this channel, they have told me that is their favorite, of course.
That's great to hear. I remember one review said it should be used as toilet paper. Yeah. They were very disappointed, but they were very positive about the previous two books. So I'm never always going to write the same book. Whereas I think, particularly for indie writers as well, if you write within series and you write within the same universe, that's quite a smart move. And with traditional, publishers, they have these characters that continue book after book after book. But I've never written sequels. I just find each new idea so compelling. There are some books I would consider a sequel to. I'd like to write a sequel to The Reddening.
I'll read it.
And I've thought of the story. That's the only one really that is starting to burn as a bit of an ambition.
Did you do any research with archaeology in The Reddening? Because that was one scene in particular that scared me the most. Kind of was they explored archaeology and what that tells us about where we come from, how it changed that everyone's thinking. And I was wondering how much of that is invented. Was there any research done in that? Did you learn some stuff about archaeology?
Oh yeah, because I knew almost nothing about paleontology it started, I hiked constantly through Devon, and I would swim in the sea and I would kayak, and I kept coming across, well, it's the most fabulous landscape. All the ages of the earth can be seen in South Devon. The geology is incredible, and to see it from a kayak and as a swimmer, an example, the sea's only a couple of 100 meters this way to the east. We have this wonderful Jurassic limestone reef. It's a UNESCO geopark, so it's a protected area. And next to it, The beaches have Permian age red sandstone cliffs and red sand. So that Permian age, that was when the earth was, so much of it was a desert. So those rocks were once south of the equator and a subtropical desert. Next to the next, an age, an era, an epoch further along, you've got Jurassic limestone, which are dead creatures. And then just a bit further down, you have slates and shales from the Devonian age. So hundreds of millions of years of history, just, within 40 or 50 miles. You can see all the history of the earth. And I started to read, there'd be plaques about where this stone was from and what was once here. So I started to take an interest in that when I was walking. And then I read another one. I mean, it was in a museum. I started going to museums and reading the prehistory of the local area. And where I live is very hilly. So it's valleys, or what they call combes, and hills. I live right on top of a hill here. And the Ice Age, I guess the last kind of big ice ages, the Younger Dryas and the one that was about 40-odd thousand years ago, they stopped on Dartmoor, which is a great big moor to the west of here. So where I live was a frozen tundra upon which lived all kinds of prehistoric creatures. But when the Ice Age thawed, you imagine millions and millions of gallons of freezing water full of rocks carved out these valleys. So it was the first time I lived anywhere when I thought, so that's why it looks this way. I became more and more intrigued by just the topography. And then I started looking at the animals that lived here. So there were giant scimitar cats, cave bears, giant hyenas that were top of the food chain, little woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos. And then I came across information that the earliest Homo sapiens, that's us, the last surviving human species, the earliest remains in Northern Europe were found here in a cave in Torquay. And then I went to Kent's Cavern, where they found these hordes of prehistoric bones, amateur archaeologists. In fact, it was a priest, a Catholic priest, and a butcher's boy that would be coated in goose grease, and on a rope he would crawl off into these caves and come back with skulls and what have you. So those caves are still there, and you can look at them, and they found this bit of a human jawbone with teeth in this cave, which is the earliest remains of modern humans in Northern Europe. And then with the carbon testing and the forensic analysis and what have you, they think it was torn off a human jaw by a giant hyena, which would either scavenged a grave, or this unfortunate caveman wandered too far away from the fire. But the cavemen, the lions, the bears, they were giant bears, but they were vegetarian, and the giant hyenas all lived in the same cave system and came in and out of different entrances. So I started visiting the caves and the museums and reading more and more about it. And then I went down some major rabbit holes. I thought, it's not enough. I need to know more. What came before that? So I even ended up reading about the formation of the universe 8 billion years ago, the formation of the Earth 4 billion years ago, but both for my own interest and because this story was forming as I was walking. I kept having set pieces like the camping scene in the Redning, and I got lost once. Some of those scenes are semi-autobiographical. I got lost, like the first scene did actually happen to me, and then I trespassed and had dogs sat on me, so that created another scene. And then I kind of made the research a bit more formal. Instead of wandering around reading plaques and going to museums, and a couple of 100 yards this way, interestingly, we have a big passage grave 9 meters long, which I think is the only one of its type in the British Isles. So then I started reading, the great writers of prehistory like Chris Stringer and what have you. And I started reading secondary text about early man in Europe and life between the ice ages. I even found out, gosh, there was an ice age 12,000 years ago. I didn't know. There's a theory that, you know, man-made climate change, greenhouse gases, have held subsequent ice ages back because the Earth constantly has this pattern of being covered in ice and what have you. So yeah, a huge amount of research, probably. Yeah, I wouldn't say more than any other book. I do tend to do a lot. There's a lot for Lost Girl, but that research and that background reading gave a whole cosmic horror element to the sense of time, epochal senses, monumental senses of time I wanted to invest into the book, and I wanted the landscape to feel as if it had the presence of former times in it. So that was quite a challenge to pull off, kind of aesthetically, with the descriptions. So yeah, to answer the question, lots of research. And it's the second novel of mine that came out of being outdoors. The Ritual came out of my experience as a camper, and I backpacked in Sweden on my own. That's where the idea for The Ritual came from. And The Reddening came from walking in South Devon and swimming and kayaking and actually being in, you know, the physical environments, and then learning why things are like that. So I don't think it's unrealistic that you could find a cave full of prehistoric remains. And there's lots of evidence of cannibalism as well throughout Europe, because, you know, food resources could be so scarce in that hostile environment.
I will pause here in our conversation. I still have part 3 to go through and edit, but I will get that out to you shortly. In part 3, Adam tells me about what he's been reading. He gives me a few book recommendations, and he shares with me some folk art. He's collected art that his work has inspired. I will leave a link in the description box to his website for you to check out. His website is very well done. There you can check out his work, order a signed copy, download a free ebook. You can even pre-order his latest book, All the Fiends of Hell, which is slated for an April 2nd release. I also invite you to check out my video where I rank all his novels according to my personal preferences, and I talk a bit about each one. If you haven't already, do go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you won't miss when part 3 is uploaded, as well as other book, horror, writing, and publishing content I put out on a regular basis. Thank you for watching. I'll see you at the next video.